everybody. Welcome to the second talk of Mesoamerican Dialogues. We're sorry for the inconvenience if somebody was trying to um, watch the conference from Facebook. So we're gonna proceed with the conference here in Zoom, and the recording is gonna be posted while we recover our Mesoamerican Dialogues Facebook page. So it's a great pleasure again to for Universidad de Guatemala and Tulane University to host a new conference in this series. So I will leave you with Dr. Marcello Canuto, Director of Middle American Research Institute, to present our conferences tonight.
Thank you, Tomas. I appreciate it. And again, allow me to pass on the same apologies to everyone for not being able to pass on or transmit this through Facebook. We had a last-minute drop in the Facebook page, and we'll have to see how that works out in the future. We apologize. Thank you for all of you who are on with us, and you probably heard a lot of the background, so we're trying to figure it out at the last moment, but so be it. The joys and the disasters of living in this virtual world. So without any further ado, allow me to please introduce to all of you the speaker tonight. He is an old friend. We've known each other for a long time. And has been a pillar of archaeological research in the Maya region for a long time. In fact, some have even hailed him as the real-life Indiana Jones, and working in the places that he has and doing the work that he's done over the last decades. From Slovenia, Dr. Prajc, has been mapping, is known largely for a lot of his field work in survey work in Campeche, in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. For decades, he has been working in that region and discovering and bringing and publishing his maps and his descriptions of many unknown sites in the region. Most recently, he was celebrated as having discovered the new sites of sites unknown to our science prior to his discovery of Chactún and Lagunita in 2013 and 14, and essentially filling in what is previously one of the large voids of our knowledge in terms of Maya settlements and very basic things about where the Maya sites are and so forth. But Ivan's work is also focused on beyond just a straight field survey and archaeology, on archaeoastronomy, and that's going to be largely the topic for this evening. He has worked tirelessly on trying to understand orientations of buildings, specific kinds of buildings, of which we will talk tonight, and trying in a very scientific way, in a very practical way, to understand the relationship between architecture, alignment, archaeoastronomy, and most importantly, meaning. What does it mean to people on the ground? Why are they building the buildings that they have done? So I could also provide a litany of articles that he has written. Of course, the one that brought him to this particular format tonight is his latest article in PLOS ONE called Astronomical Aspects of Group E-Type Complexes and Implications for Understanding Ancient Maya Architecture and Urban Planning. That has been the focus of will be the focus of his talk today. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Ivan Prajc tonight at our talk. And Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcello. Thank you for these words, and good afternoon to everybody. Buenas tardes a todos. Well, in the very first place, I want to say that it's a great privilege and honor to be able to speak at this event. So thank you very much, Marcello and Tomas Barrientos, for inviting me to give this talk. So I will now try to share the screen, share my screen, and you will let me know if you can see what I see. So this is my presentation. Okay. Can you see the screen now? The introductory one. Marcello, can you just confirm?
Yes, yes, Ivan, we can.
So everything's okay, yeah. I think Marcello has said enough, and I wouldn't now, without much introduction, I would just start with Group E of Washaktun, with the eponymous group of the complexes of this type. Since the 1920s, when Franz Blohm and Oliver Rickardson interpreted this Group E of Washaktun as a solstitial and equinoctial observatory, it has been a common, widespread opinion that the complexes of this type had a very important role in Maya astronomical observations. And even nowadays, in modern scholarly literature, we can still often read that, that these complexes serve for marking the equinoxes and solstices, even though it has long been known that most of the groups of this type have orientations very different from the one at Washaktun, which is almost perfectly cardinal. Now, some scholars have recognized this fact, but many different hypotheses have been forwarded. On the one hand, we have those that interpret these compounds as marking different astronomical events, like sunrises on different dates of the year, or even the positions of stars or planets. On the other hand, some scholars have argued that these complexes had no observational functions, but were rather only commemorative allusions to celestial cycles without any observational function. So I just wanted to test these varied hypotheses, and for that purpose, I recently measured 71 E groups in the central Maya lowlands, where we have the highest concentration of the complexes of this kind. And for comparative purposes, I also measured orientations of 79 structures of other types. Here you have the map showing the distribution of these sites. Now, I don't have time, obviously, to discuss various hypotheses about E groups. Everything on all this is discussed in the recently published article in PLOS One, as well as in this monograph, which is in Spanish and which contains much more exhaustive information on, particularly on individual sites and on the significance of particular alignments. And both these publications are freely accessible online, can be downloaded. So just to remember, a typical E group or Group E type assemblage is composed of Western pyramid and an elongated platform on the eastern side of a plaza. But there are three basic variants, versions of these complexes. The so-called La Venta type, which is the earliest one, has only the Western pyramid and the eastern platform. The Cenote type, which is most widespread, has a single central structure on the eastern platform. And the much later Washaktun type has three buildings on the eastern platform. Now, in each of these complexes that I measured three lines, three alignments, which have been typically interpreted as astronomically significant. One is the central axis, which connects the Western pyramid with the center of the eastern platform. And the other two alignments connect the Western pyramid with the extremes of the eastern platform, or outer edges of the lateral temples on this platform. And I will briefly call these alignments north and south lateral alignments. So just to remember, apparently the E groups represent the earliest, or one of the earliest, standardized forms of Maya monumental architecture. They start appearing in early middle pre-classic probably even earlier in the southern Gulf lowlands or in the Chiapas highlands along the Pacific coast, and they remain in vogue up to the early Classic. Well, there are still some regions like Eastern Petén when they continue to be constructed in late Classic, but normally their construction ceases during the early Classic. Now, this histogram shows the distribution, the frequency distribution of azimuths of central axis of E groups. You can see here that most of them are skewed south of east or clockwise from cardinal direction. This is a common characteristic, long known characteristic of Mesoamerican architectural orientations. There are some exceptions in certain regions or periods, but most of structures are skewed clockwise from cardinal direction. That means south of east or viewed differently, north of west. I don't have time now to argue about possible reasons or significance of this skew, but this has also been published. If someone is interested in that, I can tell it later. Now, if we add to the central axis of E groups the east-west orientations of other buildings that I have measured in the same area, we can see that their distribution is very similar to the one exhibited by central axis of E groups. We do have some orientations here which are skewed north of east. So that is a regional peculiarity. We can see on this map here that most of these structures that are deviated counterclockwise from cardinal directions are concentrated in this region of eastern Petén and western Belize. So this is some kind of regional peculiarity that is likely connected with some kind of political relations. And it is also attested in ceramics and also in some in epigraphic evidence. So there must have been some kind of political relations among the entities in this area. Now, if we add to this histogram the azimuths of lateral alignments, here are now the northern laterals, and now if we add southern laterals, we can see that their distribution is much more dispersed and not coincident with orientations of other structures. Now, this is the first indication that lateral alignments were not astronomically motivated. The second interesting thing is that you can see here that many of these lateral alignments are beyond the angle of annual movement of the sun along the horizon. But since most of the E groups are skewed south of east, and since eastern platforms are regularly symmetrical to the central axis, we can see that about 57% of southern laterals lie beyond the angle of solar movement along the horizon, but only about 14% of northern laterals lie beyond the axis. So it is, one can reason, if lateral alignments had been astronomically significant, then we would hardly have this symmetry in the eastern platform, because they would have hardly found interesting astronomical events placed symmetrically with respect to the central axis. So this is, again, one reason for arguing that lateral alignments were not astronomically significant, and they were not laid out with the purpose of marking certain astronomical events. And now we will see further arguments right away. This is now a graph only showing the distribution of solar sunrise dates corresponding to alignment. But before that, I must say that this graph was elaborated using the method known as kernel density estimation, or KDE. The advantage of this method over the simpler histograms is that the errors assigned to individual values are taken into account. So each value, when I measured the alignments, I always try to estimate what is the possible error of the azimuth, of the direction that I measured. Of course, I estimated it on the basis of uncertainties due to the current state of the structures. So the error of each value is represented in this method as a standard deviation of the nominal value. So each value is actually represented as a Gaussian curve with a normal distribution centered on the nominal value. And all these Gaussian curves are then summed up, which means with a special software, which means that similar values, as you can see on this lower image, if we have similar values, then these errors tend to cancel out. And we can expect that the resulting curves, that the resulting peaks represent the intended values quite accurately. So this is the advantage of this method over simple histograms. And now the above graph represents the distribution, relative frequency distribution based on KDE of the dates corresponding to central axis and lateral alignments of E groups, as well as to other types of buildings. So you can again see that distribution of dates corresponding to northern and southern laterals is quite dispersed. There is no clearly discernible pattern that could be meaningfully explained in astronomical terms. On the contrary, the central axis are much more pronounced. Of course, higher peaks represent more significance. And we can see that some peaks, some dates recorded by central axis of E groups are even identical to those marked by other types of buildings. So this is another argument in favor of what I said, that the central axis were laid out on astronomical basis, but not so the lateral alignments, which has been a common opinion. And there are also some contextual data which support this opinion. It is obvious that central axis of E groups were important for various reasons, because they were, wherever the excavations were able to establish it, we can see that the central axis were maintained throughout various construction stages that most of E groups have. And besides, they were often highlighted by offerings, burials, and other buildings which have the same orientation. Now, so this is, it's obvious that central axis of E groups were important. They were maintained and highlighted during many centuries. On the other hand, we don't see anything like that in relation to lateral alignments, because they were often altered along the various construction stages. We will see several examples quite soon. And we find no other buildings, no other archaeological vestiges along the lateral alignment. Now, to understand the meaning of the orientations of E groups, we must first see what can be said about the orientations in the Maya lowlands and in Mesoamerica in general. I've researched that for quite a number of years. So on this graph, you can see the distribution of dates corresponding to the orientations of about more than 300 buildings and complexes in the Maya lowlands in general. And you can see that the dates recorded by the orientations are concentrated in 4 seasons of the year, which have an obvious agricultural significance. On the one hand, we have dates around February, which is of course the season of preparing the cultivation plot. Then there's another season that corresponds to the beginning of the rainy season and to the time of maize planting. And then there are other dates when in August, when the first corn crops appear, and those in October, November, which is the time when the rainy season ends and the harvest starts. So there's evidently something agricultural in the dates marked by alignment. But there's something else. You can see that the most prominent peaks here corresponds to February 12 and October 30. And the distance, the interval from February 12 to October 30 is 260 days. So this calls attention, of course, because this interval is equivalent to the length of the Mesoamerican ritual calendrical cycle. Now, on the other hand, the same orientation group tends to mark on the other horizon, on the western horizon, this other pair of dates, and these intervals do not seem significant. Now, even more, what we can say, I've also plotted the intervals recorded by all prominent orientation groups in the Maya lowland. Now, first, we have to recall that each orientation, except the solstitial one, each orientation corresponds to 2 sunrise and 2 sunset dates. So each pair of dates divides the year into 2 complementary intervals, whose sum is always 365 days. And we can see again the most prominent orientation group records these two intervals on the eastern horizon and these other 2 on the western horizon. And you will see that all of the prominent, most widespread orientation groups record intervals, at least one of them is a multiple of either 20 or 13 days. Now, of course, 20 and 13 days were elementary periods of the 260-day cycle, which means that these observational schemes were somehow related to the formal calendar. And we can imagine that it seems obvious that the orientations allowed the use of observation calendars, which facilitated a proper scheduling of agricultural activities and related ceremonies. Now, we need to remember that the dates marked by orientations were canonical dates. There are many analogies even nowadays in ethnographical reporting. I don't have time to go into that, but I have presented a lot of evidence in my publication. So even nowadays, we can see that present-day farmers still use as important canonical agriculturally important dates, many dates that are recorded by orientation, or some dates which are close to those dates, because of course they had to adapt they had to conform those days with the present day Christian festivals. So just like the present day Christian festivals serve for preparing for performing ceremonies for the success of the agricultural cycle, by analogy, we can infer that the dates recorded by alignment serve the same purpose. So why these intervals? Well, if someone knew the mechanics of the formal calendar and the structure of the observational calendar, it was relatively easy to predict important dates. We must remember that the intervals that were multiples of 20 days connected the days with the same sign in the 260-day cycle, and the intervals which were multiples of 13 days connected the dates with the same numeral. So it was relatively easy to predict important dates, even if direct observations were impeded by cloudy weather. And it was not only the problem of direct observations. This anticipatory aspect of observational calendars must have been very important, because the rituals, the ceremonies had to be prepared ahead of time. And we have again ethnographic analogies from that, and not only from Mesoamerica, even from the North American Southwest, very illustrative analogies. So this is what is the most, in my view, the most plausible explanation of the function of architectural orientation. which was, of course, important because we have to remember that the formal calendar in Mesoamerica, the 365-day calendrical year, they didn't have any regular adjustment system like intercalations such as we have to maintain their calendrical year in constant agreement with the year of the season, with the tropical year. So their calendrical year was slowly shifting through the year of the season, which means that astronomical observations never ceased to be important. Well, I can mention that for the Maya lowlands, we also carried out some statistical analysis, and it turned out that the most prominent orientation groups mark intervals which are also statistically significant because their significance is above the 3 sigma level. So this was also published. Now let's see several examples. This is an E group. This is the E group of Kashba, which is a site in eastern Petén, marking this pair of dates, which, as I said, is the most prominent orientation group in the Maya lowlands, not limited only to E groups, but mostly materialized in buildings of other types. This is another example in Chicantina, in southern Campeche, close to the Guatemalan border, the same orientation. El Mirador, we can see this middle pre-classic E group in the Pava complex, marking this pair of dates even before the Danta was constructed. But then later, late pre-classic structures were built with the same orientation. So this is one example that astronomical function could not have been related only to E groups, which has been a common opinion, because other structures later imitated the same orientation. Now let's see what are the most prominent orientation groups in E groups. Now this is a relative frequency distribution of intervals marked on the eastern horizon. The greatest number of E groups, their central axis, mark interval of 160 days, which is 8 times 20 days, on the eastern horizon, and also many buildings of other type. You can see this other curve here, which corresponds to other structures. The dates that delimit this interval are October the 2nd and 11th of March. Now, here are some examples. Ushul, several E groups in the Ceibal area, minor size, but nonetheless. I must say that most of the E groups were measured in field, but I could also determine several alignments with the aid of LiDAR imagery. And several other types of buildings, like this structure E of Nakum, is marking the same pair of dates on the eastern horizon. And the same interval of 116 days must have been important in Nakum because it is also recorded by structure Y, which is the highest, the most prominent building of Nakum. But in this case, on the western horizon, the delimiting dates are April 3rd and September the 10th. Now, the same group of orientations tends, the dates that correspond to this group on the western horizon are rather dispersed. So that would be an indication that most of these orientations were functional only to the east. But we cannot a priori discard the possibility that these alignments, the central axis, were not also, or in some cases, functional to the west. Because that is the case with other types of Mesoamerican buildings. We know that many Mesoamerican buildings were either functional to the east, others to the west, or some of them even in both directions. So it is very likely that also the central axis of E groups, some of them were functional to the west. And this is particularly likely in those cases, which are not so few, when the central building on the eastern platform, the central structure, is higher than the western pyramid. So it was easier to observe westward. Now, in this case, we can see that those orientations that mark 160-day interval on the eastern horizon tend to mark somewhere around 200 days on the western horizon. And the delimiting dates are March 31st, September the 12th. Not all of them mark these dates, but in some cases, even some of these groups could have been functional in both directions simultaneously. One interesting case is definitely Nixtun Chich at the lake of Petenica in Guatemala. Here we can see, well, this is famous because it's one of those few sites with evident grid pattern, which is not so common in the Maya area. So we can see here these E groups were apparently the earliest buildings on the site, middle pre-classic, some mid-first millennium BC. And you can see here that the lateral alignments are different. They were not so important, apparently, but both groups are placed along the same central axis. Actually, they share the same central axis. And at some later point in the late pre-classic, several other buildings were placed along the same axis, including this huge triadic complex. What that means, of course, and they have the same orientation, you can see here, as long as one can discern from this map. So that, of course, means that the astronomical observational function could not have been exclusive of E groups, because when these other buildings were constructed, they are higher, so they block the view to the horizon. So at some point, this observational function was transferred from E groups to other types of buildings. And the central axis could have been observationally functional in both directions, marking 160-day interval to the east and 200 days to the west. So one and a single alignment, the dates recorded by this alignment could have been incorporated in a single observational calendar composed of calendarically significant intervals. So the intervals of 200 days from the sunset along this city axis was subdivided by sunrises along the same direction into multiples of 20 days. And something like that has been found in many other cases in other Mesoamerican regions. The same situation is found at Hatzcap-Keel, which is an outlier of Caracol in Belize. And another interesting thing here is that to the west, the central axis points to this hilltop on the horizon. And this is hardly coincidental because we have many such cases that the buildings were aligned both astronomical and to some prominent horizon feature, particularly in mountainous regions, of course, like central Mexico. Another interesting case is the E group of Mundo Perdido at Tikal. Again, we have 160 days to the east. And what is interesting here too is that Mundo Perdido was subject to extensive excavations, which showed that the eastern platform changed in dimensions and shape during consecutive construction stages from the middle pre-classes up to the classic period, which of course means that lateral alignments were not paid much attention. Since the dimensions changed, the lateral alignments also changed, but not so the central axis. The central axis was maintained the same throughout the construction period. This has been established by excavations, and also along the central axis there were several offerings, including some ceramic pieces with designs that Laporte and Cialco interpret as having astronomical significance. And also there was Stela 39 found along the central axis, which commemorates a period ending in AD 376, celebrated by Chak Tok Ich Ak, who is probably the occupant of the tomb, which was also found along the central axis. So again, we have the importance of central axis, but not of the lateral alignment. And one other interesting detail is that the palace, residential palace of Choctaw Kichak, is structure 5B46. It has a similar orientation, but slightly different. This palace marks the sunsets on March 31st and September 12th, which I already mentioned. So the 4 dates could have been, again, incorporated in a single observational calendar composed of calendrically significant intervals, identical to the one that we can reconstruct from Nishtun Chich. At Nakum, we have the importance of 200 days again. The E group in North Plaza records the same dates on the western horizon. And this is one example of those cases that the central building on the eastern platform is notably higher than Western Pyramid, which in this case is not even a pyramid, just a low platform. And again, in this case, we have offerings and barriers along the central axis. And even among these offerings, there were representations of the sun god. And actually, these are representations of the night sun, which of course agrees with the Western directionality because the night sun was associated with the West. On the other hand, we have another E group in Central Plaza, which records another 200-day interval on the eastern horizon, but with March 14 and September 30 as the limiting date. And this interval must have been very important at Yashha as well. It is recorded by the Mala group on the eastern horizon, the same dates. By the E group at Kurukwit in eastern Petin. At Machtun, we have the E group in North Plaza. Again, here also the offerings were found along the central axis in front of the central structure on the eastern platform. And also prolonged to the east, the central axis passes over 2 mounds visible on this lighter image, some 400 or 500 meters east of the E groups. So the central axis is emphasized by the placement of 2 other buildings. And the very same dates are recorded by the triadic structure 1. E group in North Plaza and structure 1 are roughly contemporary from the transitional period from the late Preclassic to early Classic. And the same orientation is embedded in structure 1. And again, prolonged eastward, this axis passes over structure 38, which is a late Classic pyramid. But evidently, this pyramid was built deliberately along the axis of symmetry of structure 1, because we know, I mean, archaeologists, Philippe Namedeo and team who excavated it, and Catherine Rees before that, they have shown that the earliest sector of the city was the western part, but at some time in the Classic, the focus of civic and ceremonial life changed to the eastern part. But at that time, the western part still remained as a place of ancestor, ritually important sector. So if that part was important, then it is conceivable that this late Classic structure 38 was placed along the same alignment and marking, of course, the same dates as the E group. And even structure 39, which is kind of a Rio Beck late terminal Classic structure, has a slightly different orientation, but this one marks a 200-day interval on the western horizon. And this orientation can also be measured quite accurate because the building is well preserved. Now, another interesting or prominent interval marked by a number of E groups, as you can see here, is the interval of 143 days, which is 11 times 13 days. The delimiting dates are October 10, March 2nd, and there are several examples. One of them is Kalak Mul, the E group on the main plaza. And probably the most interesting one is, of course, Seibar, where Takeshi Nomata and his team found actually the earliest E group known so far in the Maya lowlands, dating back to the 10th century BCE. So this E group also marks the same dates with a 143-day interval of the eastern horizon. And again, in this case, what we can see is that not only the dimensions of the platform, of the eastern platform change, even its position. In the very early phase, in the phase Real 1, dated somewhere to the 10th century BCE, the eastern platform was placed much closer to the western platform. And then it moved slightly, each time more to the east. In the Real 3 phase, it was already here, and ending with the late classic position, which is nowadays exposed. So we can see, of course, that the lateral alignment changed over many centuries, but not so the central axis, which was maintained constant and the same over some 1,500 years. And also in this case, we have other structures that have the same orientation, the pre-classic huge A24, and even the late classic structure A3, which is the one which was heavily restored and reconstructed. But it's reasonable to assume that there were sufficient elements that the original orientation is preserved. So I measured that, and it really coincides with the axis, with the central axis of the E group. So again, it was not only the E group that was astronomically important. Apparently, in the late classic, the E group ceased to be ritually important. There's archaeological evidence about that, and evidently it couldn't have been astronomically functional anymore when this high central structure on the eastern platform was built, because it blocked view to the horizon. So it didn't, the E group, the late version of E group was not astronomically functional anymore, but the same observational function was transferred to other buildings. Now we also, in this case, a number of offerings and even monuments were found along the central axis, including this interesting, very early offering, 118, which consists of 11 greenstone cells or axes. So, I mean, there's no way to prove it, but we can, of course, suppose or speculate that these 11 axes alluded to 11 trecenas, 11 13-day periods, which compose the 143-day interval recorded on the eastern horizon by this group. Now there was a 12th cell, but that one was much smaller and placed on a higher level, so it probably didn't form part of the original deposit. So what seems to be important is those 11 cells. The same dates are recorded by this Plaza F at Yashha, not only by this E group, but again we can see other buildings and even this enormous northeast Acropolis with the same orientation, but nothing along the lateral alignment. Now, what is also obvious that not the E group could not serve for astronomical observations when northeast Acropolis was built, because it's much higher. We don't know exactly the chronological relationship between the E group and this Acropolis. Apparently, all these structures are, with some exceptions of one, were built during the late pre-classic. But evidently, when this building was constructed, it was the highest pyramid of northeast Acropolis that could have served as a sports site, and not the central structure on the eastern platform of the E group, which is much lower. And evidently, the interval of 143 days was important at Yashha because it is also marked by another E group at Plaza C, but in this case on the western horizon, the delimiting dates are April 11 and September 1st. Also by the late pre-classic North Acropolis, and even by the twin pyramids in the late classic in Plaza A. And we can see that indeed, also on the western horizon, the interval of 143 days figures quite prominent, and these are the delimiting dates. So what about the famous equinoxes, which are so often still mentioned in relation with eclipse? Well, I must say that I spent quite a few years researching the orientations throughout Mesoamerica, but I haven't found any compelling evidence of the awareness of true astronomical equinoxes in Mesoamerica. Well, this is actually not surprising. The equinox is a Western concept. It's based on geometrical Greek astronomy, and it requires a very specific celestial coordinate system with celestial equator and something that is difficult to imagine that would have been independently invented in other parts of the world. But okay, we can always say that that was possible. The most important thing is that we don't have any evidence, not even ethnographic. I have never seen any compelling evidence, even in epigraphy, and certainly not in architectural alignment. What we do have is the so-called 2 quarter days. March 23rd and September 21st are the dates that are very often marked on the western horizon by sunset, not only in the Maya lowlands, as you can see on this graph, but also elsewhere in Mesoamerica. Now, these 2 dates fall 2 days after the spring equinox and 2 days before the fall equinox. Now, we call them quarter days because these dates, together with the solstices, divide the year into 4 approximately equal periods of 91 days. And definitely these dates were known in Mesoamerica just by counting dates from solstice to solstice and divide them. And of course, we can also find them in E-groups. We have several examples: Ishkol, Eastern Patin, Group D of Washington, which is another E-group at Washington, some E-groups in the area of Ceibal. And the interesting thing is that in our area, there are also several E-groups that mark or several other buildings too, that mark this pair of dates on the eastern horizon. And this is, of course, because we have several alignments skewed north of east. One example is Naranjo. Here we have an E-group almost cardinally oriented, but slightly skewed, and it corresponds to sunrises on quarter days. Now, that was pre-classic, but when this huge complex with pyramids here on the eastern extreme was built, these buildings blocked the view to the horizon. At that point, apparently the same orientation was transferred to structure B15, which is a royal palace, late classic, and it can be quite accurately measured because these walls have even the remains of stucco. And that is the same orientation. So it corresponds to quarter days on the eastern horizon. And this is not surprising because Naranjo, of course, lies in this area where counterclockwise orientations are rather common. Now, to end with, what about Group E of Washington? Well, Oliver Ricketson and Franz Blom before that, they suggested that it served for pinpointing solstices and equinoxes. And already Ricketson established that the most adequate, the most convenient point would have been somewhere on the stairway of the Western Pyramid, which supposedly would have corresponded to the early stage of the Western Pyramid. But even Ricketson already was aware of the fact that the central axis was skewed about 1 degree south of east. So the equinoctial direction actually went not over the central doorways, but over the northern jambs of the central door. And Aveni and Hartung later confirmed the Richardson's observation. They also said that Group E of Washington could have served as an approximate solstitial observatory, but not as an equinoctial one, because the central temple E2, blocked the view to the horizon, to the equinoctial sunrise. Now, even that idea must now be questioned, because the excavations in the Group E of Washington in the 1990s established or uncovered the fact that structure E7 sub 1, which was the earliest one, and on which the supposedly ideal observation point was located, was built in the early stage of late pre-Classic. At that point, there was an eastern platform with a central structure. Now, in the late stage of late pre-Classic, structure E7 sub 2 was built, which is the one currently exposed. The eastern platform was enlarged, but it still had only the central structure, superstructure. Now, in the early phase of the early Classic, the Western Pyramid was enlarged, so was the eastern platform, but it still only had one central building. So it was not until the middle Classic period that the lateral temples on the eastern platform were built. So that means that these temples were built when the ideal observation point had long been covered. Now, this in turn means that when structure E7-3, the latest pyramid, Western Pyramid, was built, which was destroyed during the excavation of the Carnegie Institution in the 1920s, the solstitial sunrises occurred far to the north and south of the lateral temples on the eastern platform. And the equinoctial sunrise did not coincide with the central axis, because the central axis is skewed about 1 degree south and east. So in fact, the dates, sunrise and sunset dates corresponding to the central axis do not have any readily apparent significance. So we are actually obliged to conclude that Group E of Washington, in its later version, in the Classic version, didn't have any astronomical function anymore, which is something that we had already observed in other cases. We can only speculate something. Now, one perhaps interesting thing is that structure E7 sub 2, which is the one that is now restored and currently exposed, is skewed slightly counterclockwise, about 1 degree north of east. If this was the original, the pre-Classic orientation of the whole Group E, then it may have marked the sunrises on the quarter days. In that case, the central temple must have been a few meters north of where the current central temple is, but we cannot verify that because we don't know the exact location. The maps of the excavation maps of the E group are not accurate enough to establish that. So it's actually a paradox that we have no compelling astronomical observation, astronomical explanation for Group E of Washington, which was actually the one that originated the whole bunch of hypotheses about the astronomical functions of E group. So to summarize, it's obvious that central axes were important because they were maintained along construction stages. Wherever it's possible to establish it, they were highlighted by offerings, burials, and other buildings, the same orientations. And they belong to widespread alignment groups, which are mostly materialized in buildings of other types. So therefore, we can say that the E groups were oriented on the basis of the same astronomical principles as structures of other types. On the other hand, we have no evidence that there was much attention paid to lateral alignment because they were altered in successive construction stages. They were not emphasized by archaeological remains, and they exhibit no clearly discernible distribution pattern. So we can conclude that lateral alignments were not astronomically motivated. Of course, we can never discard some exceptions, but it couldn't have been a general practice. And the conclusion from all this is that the E-groups were not merely allegorical allusions to celestial cycles, as some scholars have suggested. They were astronomically oriented, but their astronomical use was not essentially different from that of other astronomically oriented structures and compounds. And to conclude, the E-groups apparently represent the earliest standardized form of Maya monumental architecture, and they also seem to have been the earliest astronomically oriented buildings. However, with the increasing architectural diversity, the orientations that were originally embedded in E-groups, as well as their observational and ritual functions, were transferred to buildings and complexes of other types, and thus substantially affected the appearance of urban layout. So one conclusion is that there are no grounds to believe that E-groups had any specific or particularly prominent role in astronomical observations. And the other important thing is that the astronomical significant alignments allow us to understand some important aspects of Maya architecture and urban planning. And finally, in relation with what has often been argued about observatories, we have to be aware that the astronomical orientations were actually only one attribute of different types of buildings. The primary functions of astronomically oriented buildings were ritual, funerary, residential, or administrative, and often related to political ideology. So the label astronomical observatory applied to E-groups or any other type of Maya structures, I'm afraid, unjustified because it overemphasizes what were evidently not their primary uses. So this is why what I have prepared, I hope it was more or less understandable. Thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I'll be happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ivan. Just excellent and wonderful talk about archaeoastronomy, and we have to be very cautious to when we say this is an observatory or things like that. Okay, so
trying to be.
Yeah. So Mesoamerican Dialogues is not a monologue. So Ivan had it's time to expose all his work. So now it's time to the dialogue, which is the other very important part of this series of themes. So I would like to introduce Dr. Ernesto Arredondo. He's a professor in the Universidad del Valle de Guatemala. Also, he graduated from UVG with his licenciatura degree, and after that he got PhD degree in La Trobe University in Australia. Dr. Arredondo has worked in the Pacific Coast in sites like Ujuste, but also on the Maya Highlands in Camnar Cuyú, and currently the director of the Mesa Baja Archaeological Project. And he has worked in several sites in the Maya lowlands like El Soce, Nachtun, Piedras Negras. He has worked with us in La Corona project. But Dr. Arredondo is also involved in different projects and activities related to archaeoastronomy, and that's why he's one of our discussants tonight. He was part of the organizing committee of the first Congress of Archaeoastronomy in Guatemala. And 2 years ago, he also was part of the organizing team for the first Mesoamerican Congress of Cultural Astronomy. So we're going to have Dr. Ernesto Redondo and Dr. Canuto as the discussants in this second part of this event. So I then will ask Marcelo and Neko to start the discussion on today's topic.
Thank you, Tomas. As prearranged with Ernesto, we have 4 questions that we will be asking of our speaker. I will ask the first one, then Ernesto will ask the next 2, and then I'll ask the last one. And we'll proceed on that in that format. So, Ivan, first of all, let me thank you again for the fascinating talk. I also want to make a point to all the attendees who are listening to us. I do want to note that Ivan is in Europe right now, so it is midnight, beyond midnight. It is 1 o'clock in the morning for him. You know, it's part of the astronomical, the archaeoastronomy to have to stay up at night and see things and how they look in the evenings. But we are really asking Ivan a lot. So again, thank you so much for dealing with the differences in time and staying with us.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So Ivan, my first question for you was you obviously, this is an incredibly fascinating and comprehensive study at a level that is really quite exciting in terms of detail, especially as you mentioned with all the new technologies like LiDAR that allows us to see things that are not at scales and so forth, or numbers of these cases that is completely unique to us nowadays. So it's wonderful to be able to see all of that. We also know, of course, that this E-group tradition is something that doesn't just exist in the Maya region, right? It's something that we can find to the west of the Maya region in the Chiapas area now, with the work that Takeshi has been recently doing in Tabasco, and of course even farther west in the Olmec region. So I thought I would ask you if you could discuss a little bit of what you see the most important characteristics of this particular architectural tradition that you're talking about, this E-group tradition, what is shared perhaps regionally amongst these areas, and what is unique to the various regions, or maybe specific to the Maya area. Like what is in Maya E-group? Is there a Maya E-group characteristic that isn't seen as much in other parts? In other words, are E-groups in the Maya area interchangeable in meaning and function to those found outside, like in the Olmec region?
Yes, well, yeah, thank you for this question. It's a complex one, but well, I've focused on Central Maya lowlands because this is the area where we find the highest concentration of E-groups. I only have, now in terms of astronomy, I can't say much because I only have the data from the Olmec area, Chiapas Highlands and the Tabasco lowlands. I only have data on La Venta and Chiapa de Corzo. So I really wouldn't venture to speculate about different patterns or whatever. Now, in general terms, we know, of course, that that the La Venta type of these E-groups is the earliest one. It, as far as we could see by Takeshi's recent research, they are rather common in Chiapas Highlands and even along the southern Gulf Coast. We do, in my case, in the central lowlands, the E-groups, that the version that predominates is the cenote type with that central structure in the eastern platform. We do have some cases of the La Venta type, at least at Ceibal, which was also uncovered by Takeshi, and Tikal. So the earliest stages were of La Venta type. Now, what does that mean in terms of the significance, of the cosmological significance, of the use of E-groups? I don't really know, but since the shapes change, there must have been some time-dependent change in the uses and in the function or in the significance of these groups. We also know that as several authors have argued, that initially the e-groups were kind of place for rituals, which served for enhancing collective identity, for cooperation of those early groups, which are actually in this transitional stage from foraging, from hunting and gathering strategies to sedentary communities and agricultural subsistence. So that apparently was important in the early stage. And later, several authors have observed, the function somehow changed because only in later times, like late pre-classic and early classic, we found burials along the central axis. So the function became to be more funerary than in the early times. So there were evidently some variations, regional variations, and time-dependent variations in the function and significance of e-groups. Now, in astronomical terms, I cannot say much. The problem is that we don't have still, my data sample is still relatively reduced, and we don't have sufficiently fine chronology for all those e-groups to say if there were any time-dependent or regional variation. But I feel, according to my data, that in astronomical terms, there were not major differences in the astronomical phenomena that they were trying to mark, or in the dates, in sunrise or sunset dates that they were trying to mark. So that is as much as I can say. And then what is also perhaps important to mention, that the definition of e-groups is sometimes flexible. You know, Jaime Auer talks about Eastern triadic complexes in Belize. I don't know if they really had, they're not so typical e-groups. What I tried to limit my research to is the complexes that share these typical characteristics of e-groups. In the case of Eastern triadic complexes, we have actually 3 pyramids instead of the Eastern platform. In some cases, Takeshi says in the Tabasco lowlands, he only has 2 pyramids aligned, 2 Western pyramids, no Eastern platform. So those are exceptional cases which I wouldn't dare to join with what has been commonly interpreted as e-groups. I'm not sure if I have managed to answer your question, but it's basically I can't answer much.
No, certainly. And of course it's a difficult, no, thank you, Ivan. And yeah. Certainly that's the general.
Just let me, perhaps I forgot. Sure. There are certain things which are shared all over the area. You know, those 4-part offerings, we have them from Ceibal to Cival, even in Chiapas Highlands, we do have them. Those offerings with 4 elements like quadripartite, like imitating 4 directions.
Right.
And of course, the greenstone self, the greenstone axis placed along the axis are from the Chiapas Highlands, from the early periods up to Cival. So there was evidently something shared in the concepts attached to all these e-groups.
Right. Actually, you're touching upon a topic that we'll cover in another question in a moment about the material culture. So I'll wait on that one to discuss that. But okay, yeah. That's great. But it's a great sort of a teaser for that. So to a certain extent, if you look at, if someone were to simply say the e-group phenomenon in Eastern Mesoamerica, or Lowland Mesoamerica, or the Maya Olmec region, and so forth, would you be comfortable saying that that's a single phenomenon, that it's cross different cultural zones, and that this is something shared, meaning that they had some similar meanings and perhaps similar functions in terms of how they operated in terms of the political dynamics that you were also discussing?
I would, to a certain extent. To a certain extent. I mean, if first they were not so burial places, and then there's something changed.
Right.
there were some changes, but I'm not comfortable with interpreting like Ciudadela or Teotihuacan as an E group. I doubt about that.
Right.
Perhaps we should first stick to the formal definition of what an E group is.
Right. Say, create the most basic definition and operate from that first.
Which is difficult, of course, because the shape may have changed, but the significance was the same.
Right.
Because when the E groups were no longer built, I'm sure that their function was transferred to other buildings.
Right, exactly. Now, let me ask you this question that sort of comes up as you were discussing this, and this is something that I think people are beginning to really investigate. I think it's a fascinating topic regarding E-groups. And now this is obviously not something that can be done easily by looking at LiDAR. Of course, not all solutions are in LiDAR. What do you think about the idea, or in your experience, of the earlier phases of construction within you? Do you think that, you mentioned a little bit about this, but do you think that they were always only E-groups, or were they other spaces that turned into E-groups in some cases? Or is it hard to know, and there might be different patterns that end up visually seen as E-groups, but might have been other things at other points in time before, in earlier phases of construction?
Before E-groups or contemporarily?
Before, in other words, a space, a platform, and an area, a meeting area turns into an E-group, let's say, or is eventually turns into a, because you talk about how an E-group changed over time, but I wondered, do you have examples of spaces that were not necessarily E-groups when they started off, but eventually were built into E-groups over time?
Well, I haven't seen them in the Maya area. But if you take a look at Takeshi's article, in the Southern Gulf lowland, he has this huge platform there, like Aguada Phoenix. And I don't know if he can tell if the E-group on that platform was first, or perhaps most likely the platform is earlier. And he has another versions of this middle formative Chiapas pattern and middle formative Lucha Magenta pattern. So I would certainly think that E-groups, at least in that area, were not the earliest monumental construction. But that's something that still needs to be figured out.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Hi, Ivan, and hi, everybody. Thank you for your talk. I really loved it, always, as usual.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have more questions now that before the talk that I would like to discuss. Yeah. But yeah, lovely work. Talking about shapes and forms, and I know that you are more interested in orientations, but recently we have discussed about the proto-classic, that period before 100 before Christ, 100 after Christ. My question is there any change in the form or in the design of the E-groups during the proto-classic time? Have you noticed any specific pattern during that time?
I haven't, but maybe this is just my fault because I didn't pay so much attention to the form and how they changed. But I was simply measuring orientation, central axis, lateral alignment, and so I don't really remember now. I don't think there's any basic. We can certainly see that during the middle pre-classic, there is a change from La Venta type to the Cenote type, which appears in the middle pre-classic already. Now, by the late pre-classic, I think we only have Cenote type, and the Washatum type appears probably only during the early classic, perhaps proto-classic. I'm not sure. So that's about the shape. Now, if you're asking about astronomy, I can only see that certain dates appear early. There are a few dates that appear early, but then we see that they are diversified. There are more dates, as if they try to pinpoint certain important moments in the year more accurately. But we can see both innovation and tradition. So certain dates that we find in the early stage are preserved in later architecture, but they are not so commonly marked anymore. So I remember there was a hypothesis, Tony Avini argued in an article years ago, that E groups were based on specific special orientation criteria. In part, he was right, but that is because the E groups are early, middle, late pre-classic, and only some of them early classic. Well, some of them are still late, but most of them are early. And since the orientation practice changed, it's obvious that there are some differences between orientation practices in early times and in later times. But I confess, I couldn't say anything more specific about proto-class.
Well, what you said about commemorate astronomical events during, like later times brings me to another question. And that is about proposal by Milan Kovac and his colleagues at Washington, talking about the North Group from the Group H. And they propose that it commemorates the constellation of Orion. To explain to the audience, this is not a traditional E group complex, but it's pretty much a big pyramid, a radial pyramid, like the one that we know from Washington, and then a triadic compound. That means 3 pyramids facing each other on top of a platform. And for them, that line between the big pyramid, the radial pyramid, and the central pyramid in the triadic acropolis marks somehow a commemoration to Orion. If this is the case, can we expect the same in other E groups? And do you agree with the proposal? Have you seen similar cases or some other case around the area?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, this had been proposed by other authors too, that some orientations could refer to Orion. I'm not sure about that specific alignment. I didn't measure that. Mm-hmm. So I would put it this way: we can never discard a single possibility that something was oriented to Orion or whatever. But we can never prove that. The problem is that we can never prove that. What we can do, and what I'm trying to do, is to find patterns. Mm-hmm. And the pattern in E groups is that some of them obviously agree with the rising direction of Orion, of the central stars of Orion. But I don't think that was the purpose. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you why. Because we have E groups that correspond to that direction in different periods. Mm-hmm. If that had been all Orion, then we would necessarily see this purpose reflected in orientation shift because of the precession. Okay. The precession is a phenomenon that affects the position of stars, and so the azimuths. And we don't see that. Mm-hmm. Those orientations that in some spot, I don't remember, I checked that. And at some moment, in some century, they do correspond to Orion. Mm-hmm. But then we find the same orientations several centuries before and after that. Mm-hmm. So if that is so, it can only refer to the sun because the sun is not subject to precession. Mm-hmm. So that's why I believe that Orion could have been an orientation target, but only exceptional, which we can never prove.
Great. Thanks, Ivan.
You're welcome.
Yeah. If Marcelo's not there, I'm going to keep on asking questions.
I'm coming.
Okay.
There we go. Well, great. So the last question or set of questions you were getting on, you were starting to discuss it a bit, and so we can elaborate a little bit further. Your discussion is heavily, for obvious reasons, focused on the orientations, the architectural alignments, and so forth, to provide all of these fascinating patterns, which, by the way, I think are incredibly convincing. So it just requires, as you said, a lot of different cases, and you can see it statistically how it works out. So to me, it's quite convincing. The question that you were bringing up and starting to discuss a bit is the material culture associated with these spaces, right? They are more than just buildings and alignments. There's, as you say, activities of different kinds, and then they're marked with with caches in different ways and so forth. So that was one of the things you were starting to talk about was, do you see some patterns, or what is the typical material culture associated with these particular architectural spaces? And what kinds of patterns do you see regionally that are shared or vary? Are centerline caches similar, for instance, across the region? Are there temporal changes and so forth? And what do you make of those differences? And also, what do you make of those particular caches? What they might have meant to the people and the activities that were being done in those e-groups?
Yes, well, yeah, this is somehow related to what I said before. I've always tried to check all this archaeological evidence to see if there is any independent evidence supporting what I'm suggesting in astronomical terms. But I couldn't find almost anything. Mm-hmm. What I found, I mentioned those 11 greenstone axes in Ceibal, which perhaps allude to 11 Trecenas, 11-13 day period. And then those night sun god representations in Nakum, which might refer to the setting sun. But everything else is so non-explicit that I don't really find any supporting independent evidence for my opinion in material culture. So that's why I now also don't remember if there are any specific regional differences, patterns in material culture. What I do remember is what I mentioned already, those greenstone axes, caches along the, which are found from Chiapas Highlands to Cival, at least, and I don't remember if in Belize, and some other things. So there were evidently some shared features, but I have an impression that there are nonetheless more differences in material culture than in the astronomical reference, because I was trying to see if there are regional patterns in astronomical reference. The only regional pattern that I've been able to see is this counterclockwise deviation in that eastern Petén, western Belize, and some preference for quarter days in that area. But we find them elsewhere too. So it's not something really limited. But perhaps certain dates were more fashionable in certain areas than in others, which doesn't mean that they were not important at all in other areas. So, and that's actually true of orientations in general. So that's why I'm saying that the E-groups were not specific observatories, because we find the same orientations materialized in other buildings. It's just, even at the same site, it just seems that in a certain community, certain dates were important, and they could have been marked by E-groups and later by other buildings or palaces or temples. And I couldn't see even in other regions of Mesoamerica that there would have been any association of a certain type of buildings with some certain orientation pattern. So there are obviously regional differences across Mesoamerica, but everything was based on the same principles. We always find these 13-day, 20-day intervals. Some dates were more fashionable here, some dates were more fashionable there. It is something to be checked with local climate variations, regime, whatever, I don't know. And some things are just pan-Mesoamerican, like February 12th, October. Not entirely pan-Mesoamerican, but in most cases you can find it. I don't know.
Marcelo, if you let me do just a last thing.
Of course.
In this case, given that it's so related to calendar, what are your impressions about the E-groups and the origins of the calendar? Sometimes pointed to the area of the Istmus, to Tehuantepec Istmus. What do you have to think about it?
Well, that's an interesting question, because so far as I know, you can correct me, the only reliable evidence of the existence of 260-day cycle is a monument tree of San Jose Mogote, 6th century BC. But of course, if Ceiba and if Aguada Phoenix are from tens from about 1000 BCE, then that count must have existed, because such orientations with these calendrically significant intervals don't have any sense without the formal, without the existence of 260-day count. And there is some circumstantial evidence that there was, I mean, Prudence Rice has argued that it is much more ancient and on the basis of figurines and their significance. And there are some interpretations of some signs in Oxtotitlan cave that they represent a calendrical sign. So there are some implications for the existence of this calendar. But again, I do think that we need more evidence for these early periods. I don't have many early sites. I mean, Ceiba, okay. I want to take a look at the Tabasco area and the Takeshi stuff to see if there's really overwhelming evidence of the use of these intervals. If that is the case, then we can be sure that the 260-day count is as old as that, at least.
All right. Let's call Takeshi, Marcelo, please.
Let's see if we can get him
Right
on the
now.
line right now.
Right now.
If it hadn't been for Facebook, maybe he would have been on it. No. No, that's it's a fascinating question, because obviously, I mean, I think that one of the interesting things to think about, and it occurs to me as we're discussing all of this, that there is questions about how things are built and why they're built in that way and what orientations they have and what meanings that might imply about the group, but that doesn't necessarily also limit what kinds of activities are done in those spaces later on that
Of course not, no.
that involve material culture activities of the kind that we're talking about. So in other words, it's interesting that what you were saying, you're finding support for maybe those two things are maybe that distinction between what the orientations and so forth, and then what the material culture might mean, have maybe to do with the fact that different kinds of activities are in the assumption of what this space might mean and what it might mean generally to everyone and the dates that are important to that group, then other things are what are at play in the individual activities that happen there, maybe over a long period of time, right? So it's interesting that's a way of thinking about the architectural alignments and what those might mean, and then the activities within them.
Right. Yeah, I perfectly agree. I mean, that's very important. It's perhaps not superfluous to emphasize again that the orientation was only one attribute of buildings. They had primary uses which were others. And I'm sure that many buildings which are or seem to be astronomically oriented, they were not intended for observation. Yeah. They were simply, they were trying to conform certain buildings to cosmologically important directions. But that doesn't mean that they were used for observation. And of course, the most prominent case is Teotihuacan, which we have the whole grid actually has only two slightly different orientations, but it's impossible to say that all those buildings were astronomically functional. They just imitated the astronomically functional orientations of Pyramid of the Sun and Ciudadela. And we have such cases in the Maya area too. And I'm also sure that, I mean, I can never be sure, but I'm almost certain that not each and every E group was astronomically oriented. There are some, which I didn't mention, but there are certain dates which I can easily calculate, but they don't seem significant. So I don't know what was intended, if anything. And there is, for example, an E group at one of two E groups at Sakul 1, which is far from the sun. It could only refer to a star, but I mean, stellar orientation is a big problem. So I don't think that all E groups were astronomically oriented, just like many monumental buildings of other types were not. But we don't know that. But there is no evidence to say which buildings were and which were not. And that's why inevitably have some noise in those histograms and graphs.
Well, thank you, Ivan. I think what we'll do now, unless, Nestor, do you have any more questions that you want to?
I have a lot. but let's proceed with the questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. And for all
audience.
the attendees that are with us, thank you very much for sticking through with us on this on this discussion. We'd like to now, as we do, is to open up the discussion to the questions that we've received through the chat and pose them to our speaker. There's a series of questions I have here in front of me, and I will just start with the first and move through them. So please bear with us as we go through these questions. So the first question comes from Chris Laser. Excuse me for the pronunciation if I did get this wrong. Ivan, do you suppose that the March 23rd and September 21st quarter days were what Ruggles defined temporal pseudo-equinoxes based upon counting days between solstices, or rather spatial pseudo-equinoxes, half-point points?
No, temporal. Spatial, yeah. If one tries to determine spatial midpoint between the solstices, then that would vary because it would depend on the horizon altitudes and whatever. So we would have very different azimuths.
Okay.
But since we always have the same date, then it must have been counted. And well, yes, some people call it temporal equinoxes or midpoints in time, whatever. Well, I prefer to use this quarter day label because, you know, in English, British tradition, they have mid-quarter days. About 10th of February and whatever, which were also subsistent. In terms of subsistence, they were important days. And since they were mid-quarter days, I said, well, then these are quarter days. But it's a label, it's my preference. I mean, I don't care if you call it temporal, but it's midpoint in time. Yeah, and that's what Ruggles says, other people too.
Wonderful, thank you.
Of course, and Ruggles is one of those that is also allergic about equinoxes. Because, yeah, and he wrote 2 articles criticizing that, you know, that we want to see the solstices and equinoxes all over the place. And people just don't know that solstices are naturally significant moments of the year because they are easily perceptible by the extremes of solar movement along the horizon. But at the equinoxes, nothing happened that would call attention by itself. It's a concept. It's a geometric concept. So it's not a naturally significant moment.
I would simply like to add that, unfortunately, we missed a golden opportunity to have your talk on a summer solstice. We should have done that. That would have been actually a good thing. We should have done it 3 days earlier, and that way we could have at least been astronomically astronomically favored. Who knows? Anyway, it just occurred to me as you were saying that. Oh my goodness, that we just. You're right. We see the solstice. We feel it, whether it's dark or light. But the equinoxes can come and go, and it's very hard to feel them or think that you've missed something.
Yeah.
Exactly. A second question that I wanted to pass on to you was from Erica, who says, the case of Ceibal, if the observations were useful for agricultural purposes, how do you explain the empty spaces, quote unquote, empty spaces around it, which Inomata explains to be because people were not sedentary yet? In other words, I guess the question has to do with the idea, if people weren't sedentary, was agriculture that important, and how would that then be relevant to agricultural purposes due to the alignment?
Well, as far as I understand Takeshi's argument, he says that the society in those early Real 1 phase was actually in the transitional phase from foragers to sedentary agriculturists. And that this subsistence maize based on the maize actually became important after 1000 BCE. So that would agree with my argument, because if subsistence was becoming important, then it's obvious that they needed some kind of proper scheduling of these events. And of course, I have no answer about what exactly these specific dates, which are different, meant. I don't know that. But we know that in different present-day communities, they also have various agriculturally significant dates. That might depend on what ceremonies they try to perform, to what kind of cultigens they refer. That's also a question. You know, at the Itzah, in the Peten present times, the 15th of April is important because of some kind of cultigen. I don't remember. So there are many questions with that which I can't answer. But the fact that if Takeshi is right, that was exactly the time when agriculture was becoming the predominant subsistence strategy, then this would make sense that they tried to establish these agriculturally significant alignments.
It also occurs to me that, and this has been discussed as well, that important agricultural practices don't necessarily have to always be about subsistence, correct? I mean, it could still be relevant and important, but not necessarily be the staple food, right? I guess that's the one point to think about as well.
Well, yeah. As far as I understand, it's the time when staple foods, agricultural produce became staple food, if I am correct. I don't know.
Exactly, right. But it's so okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. We have another question. This is written in Spanish, so I'm going to translate it on the fly, and Carolyn will translate it back into Spanish. So I hope that it'll be interesting experience. So it's Jared Figueroa says, excellent talk. I only have one question. This actually has to do a methodological question, which has to do with how do you discover and how do you identify a ruined building or the ruins of a building in a mountain or in nature? That is, how is it that we recognize these things? Perhaps this is particularly referring to LiDAR and so forth. How is it that we come to recognize buildings? It's a more general question for the general audience, but how is it that we recognize buildings and are sure that we're looking at architecture?
I think you can answer that.
I can, but I'm going to let you go ahead and do it.
Well, I mean, it's either surveys, field surveys, or LiDAR, remote sensing, whatever. And as simple as that. So sometimes, in some cases, I wasn't even there. I only used LiDAR imagery, you know, digital elevation models, so I can see where the highest point of the Western Pyramid or the Western Mound is, where the highest point of the Central Mount on the Eastern Platform is, and where the extremes of the platform are. And in other cases, I mean, I didn't discover any of these e-groups. None of them was found by me. Mm-hmm. They were all published, they are all known, and I used published data. So this is something that other people have discovered. I mean, I found a bunch of other sites. But
of course. And it occurs to me, this is a simple question. And you may have mentioned it, I missed it, but just out of curiosity, with LiDAR data, how much greater is the data set? Is it exponentially?
Enormously.
Yeah.
Enormously, of course, enormously. Just that we don't have as much LiDAR as we would wish, and I don't have access to all the LiDAR. So,
right.
You know.
But it's still
in some cases it's even more reliable. LiDAR is more reliable because in the field you just don't see things. Right. It's all on the bush, on the cover, and I cannot even take readings because I don't see those things. So I had to, when I was in the field, in many cases I had to put some auxiliary points for taking readings in both directions and so on. I mean, yes. The method is described in the publication.
Right. I mean, I think it's good to point out that your background is not what is typically found, not what we typically see in the field, right? Yeah. So it's not something that you know, and that's a really important point about the ability.
And of course the Takeshi's Aguada Phoenix is one example that nobody knew about this enormous site because you just don't see it in field because it's so huge, and exactly. the elevation differences are so small, and there are ranches and cattle and whatever, you don't see that.
Right.
But you can see perfectly well on LiDAR.
Exactly, hiding in plain sight in that case, right? It's for everybody to see, but nobody to recognize. No, very true.
Yeah, yeah.
And let's say also for the audience that it depends where you're working, because if you're working, for example, in the lowlands, in the Petén or South Yucatan, you can find, for example, stones that were cut on the surface, and that could be an indication. But if you are in some other area where they were not using stone, well, the things get a little bit more complicated probably, because there you will have structures that are made of mud, and that is different from the architecture where Ivan has been working for many years.
Yeah.
I have another question from Manuel Mai, who says, cheers, Ivan. Would you say that the ritual function would be prominent in Washaktun's E group? And if so, would you relate rituality there with symbolic days or with liminal spaces of the Maya cosmos, namely temples on Eastern platform hosting deities of that direction?
Manuel, nice to hear you. Yeah, I know what you published. Of course, I think that you are right in many interpretations of what you're proposing in your PhD and in the papers you published. So yes, I think it was certainly ritual. It may have had all those functions that you proposed. I don't have any objection that I could base on any reasonable argument.
Okay, I hope Manuel was here to listen to hear that, and if you would like to respond, I'm happy to pass along this your response. That's great. I have another question from, I think that from Tomas, who asks, how many E groups exist outside the Maya, Mijizoque, and Gulf Coast regions? So besides the areas that we were discussing earlier, how many E groups would you estimate? Is it possible to know, or is it something that you would be willing to hazard a guess? And Tomas is referring for the possible E group in Teotihuacan, Ciudadela, which you just mentioned in one of your answers. But can you think of other potential E groups outside of those?
I don't think so. The only compounds that I would dare to define as E groups are from the Pacific Coast, Chiapas Highlands, Southern Gulf Coast, Tabasco Plain, and to the Maya lowlands. I think the most northern ones are like Yashuna, but they are rare. I mean, the northern lowlands, they are rare. You can find them to Belize, let's say all over the Maya lowlands, but they are most concentrated in the central lowlands. And I wouldn't dare to say that there are more E groups further on, like Oaxaca. I don't know. I don't see them. Or I wouldn't dare to define them as E groups with the same underlying concept.
Right. That certainly doesn't take away the possibility of there being relevant astronomical orientations of the buildings that they build that might be agricultural in nature, so that the very function of it, what you're talking about, not necessarily in the form that you see as E groups.
I mean, there are astronomical buildings all over the place, all over Mesoamerica, but not E groups. I don't see.
So does that render it a much more of a lowland, kind of an Eastern Mesoamerican, more than lowland, I guess, an Eastern Mesoamerican phenomenon?
Apparently so, yeah.
And they don't go, and we don't see them heading farther south in the Maya, farther east and south of the Maya area.
Well, not in the highlands. Have you seen them?
That's what I was thinking. I was trying to think about how far in Honduras and so forth farther, and I can't think of any that have been.
You haven't seen them in Copan, have you?
That I can remember, no.
And there is one option that has been proposed in Caminal Juyu, but given the high destruction of the ancient settlement, it's pretty much impossible to know if there was something like that. It looks like one, but very difficult nowadays to say or to compare.
Yeah.
Well, Ivan, thank you so much. I think that pretty much, in one way or another, you answered. There were some other questions in the feed, but in your other answers, I think you answered most of the topics that were brought up. So I wanted to, again, this has been on, we've now reached 7 p.m., which is 2 o'clock in the morning, I think, for you. So that's just not fair to ask you to stay up any farther. Although if you're like me, after a certain point, once I pass the threshold, I'm up for another 3 hours. I can't go back to sleep, but I'm still not going to demand much more of you. So again, thank you for answering our questions, both Ernesto's and mine, as well as the audience. This has been extremely exciting for me, and to hear you're talking about this topic. Tomas, I give you the final word if you'd like to close up to this evening's events.
Thank you. So I would like to thank you again, Ivan, for staying up all night on a Thursday. And also to Dr. Ernesto Redondo to be our discussant today. And of course, for all the Mesoamerican Dialogue team that is now conformed, of course, Melissa, Cecilia, Maria Jose, and all the team in Tulane. Thanks for having our second talk in the series. So we're sorry about the Facebook Live, but we're going to be uploading the recorder meeting as soon as possible. So if you know some people that were waiting for the talk and could not log into Zoom, just spread the word. It's going to be in Facebook Live soon, and we won't pass the new questions in Facebook, Ivan. I'm glad that we had enough questions in Zoom to actually make it to 2 hours. So again, it's been very interesting, and we'll be uploading also some of your articles for the people that are interested in this topic and would like to know more details. So I hope the next time we see you, Ivan, will be in the field or something, not just a virtual background, but I mean, we need some field work soon. If not, I don't know what's going to happen to all my archaeology. I mean,
yes, we do. Yeah, yes, we do.
We're all getting antsy.
Yeah.
Jungle for everybody. So, and for all the attendants, thank you for being here, and see you for our next talk in July. Good night.
Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and have a good evening.
So thank you very much for inviting me, and to all the audience. Muchas gracias y saludos a todos.
Hasta luego. Bye. Thank you so much, Ivan.
Goodbye.